Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our learning community addressing veteran and military substance use, promoting recovery through collaboration and compassion. Our learning community series is on session 3. So here with us today, we have two great presenters for you. There'll be plenty of time for some facilitated Q&A and any additional discussion that we'll have today. You will be receiving a copy of the slides as well as a recording. I know that question will always come up, so just want to hit that off the top. Today's session, state and community approaches to supporting veteran and military recovery. Next slide, please. All right, and you may be used to Chantel guiding us through the waters here. I'm stepping in for Chantel today. My name's Phil Patty. Maybe you've gotten a chance to work with me with one of my many teams or initiatives I'm on. But I am a project associate here at SAMHSA Service Members, Veterans, and Their Families Technical Assistance Center and Policy Research Associates. Next slide. All right, disclaimer off the top here. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. As a SAMHSA-funded entity, the SMVF TA Center complies with current executive orders and aligns with SAMHSA's strategic priorities. Current priorities do not support harm reduction as outlined in SAMHSA's Dear Colleague letter on harm reduction. Next slide, please. Okay, our agenda for today, we're in the middle of the welcome. We'll have a chance for everyone to introduce themselves through the chat. We'll have a bit of an overview of the session. And then we will get right into our presentations with Susan and Jennifer here today. There will be a couple of kind of facilitated times for some Q&A. So we have a couple questions in the interim that will kind of get our brains started there. But I encourage, as we are hearing the presentation, as you have a question or a comment that comes across, you can enter that into the chat box. You can save it to say it out loud when we do get to that piece of time as well. I encourage everyone to use that raise hand and all those good functions that Zoom comes with today. But we'll have the time for that. And then we will get to a short wrap up and we'll talk next steps. Next slide, please. All right, a few housekeeping pieces here. As it is an interactive session, please set your name to how you'd like to be referred to during this virtual meeting. Just make sure that's all good to go. Sometimes it does come in with something preloaded. Just make sure you're all set there. Disable any AI transcription or recording services. We'll be using the live transcription setting in lieu of that. And then, as always with our virtual convenings, just to create a little bit greater sense of community in this virtual space, if you are able to put your video on, we encourage that, especially during that Q&A portion for the back and forth there. And then along with that, mute your microphone unless you are speaking to the group to prevent any background noise. Maybe working from home, some kids, dogs, animals in the background. Just make sure you are muted, but also on mute when we do get to that Q&A portion as well. And as I mentioned before, using the raise hand when we do get to those live Q&As. Chat box is always open as well. And there is a Q&A pod as well if you'd like to enter through that in addition. Next slide. Okay, just going to walk us through our learning community session objectives here. Number 1, identifying state and territory level challenges and barriers that impact substance use treatment and recovery for veterans and military connected individuals, including crisis support needs. Introduce participants to services such as the military helpline, peer and family support workshops, and military culture training that strengthen recovery systems for service members, veterans, and their families, and also to explore how state agencies, community providers, and independent nonprofits can coordinate to deliver culturally sensitive, military-informed prevention and recovery services. Next slide, please. All right, here's where you all come in. If you wouldn't mind entering your name, agency, along with your state, territory, or tribal affiliation that you're representing today. And you may, check a couple of those boxes. So Please go ahead and enter that information in the chat so we can know all who's with us, and thank you. Next slide. All right. And as you are doing that, I just want to again give a warm welcome to everyone for joining us today from your neck of the woods to be able to hear to our two great presenters today. I know we're going to cover a number of topics here, and like I said, we will have a couple interactive portions today where you'll get a chance to ask about maybe a program that's like-minded that you're taking part in your state, territory, local community, maybe on one of your initiatives. So a good chance to be able to, ask our subject matter experts some questions and hear some lessons learned here today. So thank you all for being with us and joining, and I appreciate everyone entering your information in the chat. Next slide. Okay, and here's our first poll question. Asking about a previous webinar. Did you attend the March 3rd webinar on addressing veteran substance promoting recovery through collaboration and compassion? This will give us a sense of the audience level for our presenters. All right. And I know multitasking, entering your name and information in the chat. Poll question. Appreciate you all. Okay. Couple folks unsure. That does feel like a year ago at this point in time, so that's all right. If you're not sure, we can definitely get you the recording as well. All right. So it looks like we got a mixed bag here. So about 5 folks have, a little bit under that have not, and then a couple folks unsure. So hopefully we'll brush up and then maybe remember if we have seen it or not. All right, thank you all. Appreciate it. All right, next slide. Okay, and now I get the privilege to introduce our two great presenters here with us today. Susan Davis, Army veteran and military behavioral health liaison with the Oregon Health Authority, outpatient services and strategic initiatives within the behavioral health division. Susan is joined by Jen Green. Jen Green, also an Army veteran, integrated primary prevention officer with the Oregon National Guard. I want to thank you both for being here and for providing us all with your time and expertise and the great topic that you're going to cover. So I will go ahead and hand it over to Susan and to kick things off.
Okay. Well, thank you, Phil. Good morning, everyone. It's morning still in Oregon, so I'm going to stick with that. But I recognize that the rest of you, or many of you, might not be over this far. So yeah, today we're going to talk about some of the initiative areas, programming areas that we are focused on here in Oregon, and our collaborative efforts to provide good services to our SMVF population. Next slide, please. So another disclaimer, our views and the opinions that we express don't necessarily represent the views of the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, SAMHSA, or the DOW or their components. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we have our own polling question here. So are National Guard members considered veterans upon leaving service? This will definitely factor greatly into the rest of our presentation. So if you wouldn't mind giving us what you know. And Jen, feel free to speak up during this.
All right. Interested to see the responses to maybe or maybe not a trick question, right? All right. 54% of you said yes, and 46% if they were federally activated as a National Guard member. All right. All right. Anyone want to clarify or state your reasoning and from your situational awareness about National Guard members? All right, so I'm going to assume with the silence, it's probably going to be a no. So we'll move on and see if we have a different answer by the time we get to the end. So Susan, next slide.
Next slide, please. Okay, so just a point of awareness. I will be focused over here largely because I'm highly reliant on my notes, so apologize for not staring at everyone. But I'd like to start by acknowledging that it can sometimes be frustrating. There can be frustration that comes along with serving a population that is often misunderstood by the community at large, and even sometimes by those of us that are within the population itself. However, with this frustration comes awareness of opportunities to educate and advocate for the needs of the entirety of our community. So for context, my position within Oregon's health administration was created in 2017. So prior to that, there was no position within the Oregon Health Authority dedicated to serving the nearly 300,000 veterans in Oregon at that time. Legislation created and funded the Veteran Behavioral Health Program, allowing for a subject matter expert within OHA to assist in consultation, advocacy, resource sharing, and connections across state agencies and community providers. With the development of OHA's Veteran Serving Program came the call to collaborate with the Oregon Department of Veteran Affairs and assess the state of behavioral health services for veterans at that time. The study brought OHA together with ODVA, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, healthcare providers across the state, and nearly 4,000 community members, resulting in 19 very specific recommendations for improving services to veterans. Since that time, OHA now has 1.5 positions dedicated to programming for the SMVF community. That includes now roughly 2,600 or 260,000 veterans, according to the VA's 2024 data. We receive dedicated funding every biennium to allow us to help address gaps in services and identified emerging needs. This is important in distinguishing OHA's programming from that of our state level VA and from the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. So OHA programming is tasked with assisting in the creation of programs that address gaps in services and emerging needs that ODVA and the VA can't or don't address. And we're also able to serve the entirety of the SMVF population rather than being restricted by eligibility requirements. So that, like I said, in 2017, there was that collaboration between OHA and ODVA. And that created this report and then those 19 recommendations. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights those recommendation areas. As I stated previously, prior to 2017, there was no position within OHA to assist in collaboration across agencies and providers when it came to veteran services. The 2019 study highlighted the need for this type of collaboration, along with the need to address several areas known to contribute to veteran suicide rates, such as transition periods, lacking cultural awareness and provider availability, lacking knowledge of resources in the community, stigma around seeking behavioral health treatment, substance use and military sexual trauma, and social determinants of health and how they sometimes block access to services. OHA's veteran programming took these recommendations very seriously, creating programming for veteran-specific peer support specialists, veteran-focused suicide prevention and lethal means safety trainings, veteran-specific substance use groups, military cultural awareness trainings, and focused outreach and education. Please take note of the fact that to this point, within this programming, I have only referenced veterans rather than SMVF or even service members. It's only been within the last roughly 3 years that we've been able to solidly shift to serving the entirety of the SMVF population through OHA's veteran programming, following the federal level shift in the VA's mission to serving the larger community. From 2017 to early 2023, programming was specifically focused on addressing gaps in services to and emerging needs of veterans, With that shift in the mission to the larger SMVF community, we've been able to broaden programming, and with this shift, we've realized a really glaring gap in our services due to the unique nature of Oregon's SMVF landscape. Next slide, and I'll turn it to Jen.
Yeah, and parallel efforts, as we all know, and Susan referenced the VA, right, and the shift in the VA. Also within the Department of War, there was also a shift happening in systems. And in 2021, shortly after the Clay-Hunt Act in 17, every year since then, they've been publishing suicide reports to Congress in regards to adverse events. And also in 2020, there was an event down at Fort Hood, Texas, that Congress petitioned across an independent review commission of responses of Vanessa Guillen, who you may have heard, who ended up having and dying inside of Fort Hood and outside. That started, and the results were published to Congress in 2021 and to Secretary Lloyd Austin at the time, and they recommended 82 findings in regards to that to reduce that harm. Also, during that time period in 2021 and 22 was a parallel effort of an independent investigation happening around suicides. They also published to Congress 127 recommendations for the Department of War throughout that span. All of those recommendations from that independent, community-based, looking at the entire enterprise was accepted by Secretary Austin and the teams in 22. What does that mean for you, right? Like I always kind of think about it, right? As this state was doing, and for us as well, Oregon's unique. We are one of 7 states that does not have an active duty installation, but we have a large militia and guard population. And so that unique landscape also does not meet the definition of veteran here. And a lot of programs and services are not eligible for National Guard members. And so we had a gap of operating also without little support of an active duty installation within our state confines and those efforts. So just kind of know we're working in the same. Across all 50 states, every single state to include yours, in 2022, the Department of War funded the National Guard Bureau for all teams to establish what was called the Integrated Primary Prevention Workforce. And each of your states have a variety of implementation. It's a fully funded team. And I am just the what's called the Integrated Primary Prevention Officer, called IPPO, or their manager at your local state. Important just to know in resourcing, because what we learned as we started partnering, and I come from the VA and working in county mental health and running a county mental health authority here in Oregon. We already knew. We knew each other. It's usually small communities that are doing this work, and we will have those relationships. And so with this, we were already working a little bit. And so it impacted us. Next slide, please. So what did we find out? And just for the bigger context before we go too far, I do want to kind of clarify what is a National Guard service member. It was founded in 1636. It was before Department of War, or most states, actually, and a variety of states in the 13 colonies. Currently, there's around 450,000 men and women serving the Guard across. Just also to note, there is only non-conforming or non-binary markers have never been tracked by the Department of Defense or War. So any of those metrics or whatnot are unknown to the organization. It does represent 50 states and all 3 territories and District Columbia. So we'll say 54 S&Ts, that's where that's coming from. The District of Columbia has its own National Guard, as well as the 3 U.S. territories. It comprises of Army and Air Force, and so it's unique. Every state has a mixture of both of that populations, and each service component has its own uniqueness. And then we always have two bosses. One's mobilized by a governor for state responses. And here in Oregon, fires, we had a huge COVID-19 response, and every state has its own uniqueness. And then we also can be mobilized by the president for any active duty mission. And most of your National Guard entities will have a mission set that they are being federalized on. So as we learn that uniqueness of our states, right, it's really important. And we're going to kind of continue to go down that pathway to kind of think about it maybe a little bit differently for us today, too, because it's really for consideration around how do we really get impact and reduce the harmful behavior. So next slide. So one of the things that we did for us in here was to really understand for our state, in order for Susan and I and the larger enterprise to really understand, we have to be able to see it. We have to be able to see it in a different way to understand resourcing and how things are delivered and what is access to care look like. What does service delivery look like within each of your geographical locations? And so this is our state, and this is not where our facilities are. This is where our people live, the communities that they live in. And so a citizen soldier is this unique construct that goes back and forth within communities that they serve. Historically, too, the Guard has shifted over the last 10, 20 years. In your communities, most of the time, the Guard members would live locally to an installation, and those times are changing specifically for your Army component personnel. They may go and drive to a community that is not their resident community during drill status. Usually on our air sides, for the most part, they are there, but there's still travel. More specifically for us of service, 4% of our current population does not live within our state. They come in from other states and also have to partner with those resources as well. So just thinking about this of services and what do we know was kind of our first areas. Susan was doing OHA and what is the gap in the VA. Here we were as well. And so we really started to align our thinking and working together and collaborating. And so I'm going to turn it back to Susan, and she's going to kind of show different versions of maps here. So you can see how it's all connected. Susan, next slide.
Yeah, so as Jen said, we're gonna show you some different data and some maps to kind of overlap, so you can kind of see the way that the entirety of our SMVF population is kind of laid out across Oregon. So as you can see, the predominance of veterans in Oregon live kind of along the western and northern areas here. Big takeaway from this slide is that we have 36 counties in Oregon. 16 have veteran populations of at least 4.5 thousand. So take note of this kind of general distribution, as it will help in kind of understanding some of the upcoming slides as we look at other maps and whatnot. Next slide.
And Susan, just to state on this, keep in mind, for us here in Oregon, majority of the National Guard is not represented with an identifier of veteran status.
Right.
So when we're thinking of this, right, this is a true veteran as a VA eligibility veteran status. So imagine Oregon Health Authority or your ODVA, and they're talking about services or numbers, but if the legal definition is not being captured, your guard, your local state guard is not reflective usually in that population. So that's just my takeaway there.
We're gonna mention this several times throughout this presentation. So yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so here we just have some general state data for Oregon. We are actually very lucky in Oregon to have a pretty robust culture of advocacy for veteran services. However, it has become increasingly important to remind interested parties that service members and veterans are a diverse group, and that they have varying histories, demographics, and service needs. So while this data shows that Oregon veterans are both slightly older and slightly less racially diverse than the national average, We are continually striving to ensure equitable programming for the entirety of the SMVF population, including our Guard. There's a lot of times when this advocacy is happening about providing services to the SMVF population, like Jen said, a lot of the data that's being referenced, a lot of the programming being referenced is very specific to veteran, by definition, veteran status in regard to eligibility. So other areas of note for Oregon's veteran demographics, 75% served during a wartime era, and 9.8% are women, according to VA 2024 data. We also know that about 5% of adults who are in the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections are veterans. All this is going to be noteworthy as we discuss existing programming later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So if you will remember a few slides ago, the distribution of Oregon veterans and the other map with the distribution of our National Guard members, the veterans are along kind of the northern and western counties. This map allows you to kind of see the overlap of VHA facilities in relation. So for context, Oregon covers 98,381 square miles. So looks small here, get it. It's big. It's a lot of area. So while these VHA facilities are relatively dispersed, this includes, again, all of the telehealth clinics, vet centers, outpatient clinics, along with the larger VHA medical centers. Also noteworthy here is that 2 of these catchment areas fall to VHA facilities that are outside of Oregon. So we're looking at Washington, we're looking at Idaho with these VHA facilities. Next slide, please. So this is, again, kind of another overlap to show you just the differences in terms of urban versus rural and remote areas. So again, for those that aren't really very familiar with Oregon, we are much, much larger than just Portland. I know a lot of people think of Portland and really only that, but we are quite diverse. We have a large rural and remote communities. So again, remembering the previous slide showing that distribution of veterans and National Guard members and those VHA facilities, you can kind of get a sense of how transportation and availability of providers, especially providers who are military culturally aware, can become an issue. On top of that is the aging trend of Oregon veterans. So now more than 50% are over 65 as of September of 2024. Also noteworthy. All of this landscape information is important in knowing what has led to OHA veteran programming specifically. Again, kind of referring back to those 2019 study recommendations. So on top of the areas that I mentioned when discussing those recommendations, services specific to women veterans, LGBTQ plus veterans, rural veterans, caregivers and family members, justice-involved veterans, and then more recently, as we've extended these collaborative efforts, are currently serving military have become more of a focus. Next slide, please. So as the topic for today is more specifically about SUD services, here are some of the specific trends for Oregon regarding our veterans. So alcohol and opioids and stimulants, especially among our younger veterans, are areas of continued or needed focus. And while we have developed programming focused on MOUD to include groups specifically for veterans and MOUD training for veterans who are certified as peer support specialists, the availability of treatment in rural communities remains limited. If you remember that last map, like I said, we have lots and lots of rural and remote areas, and transportation, and especially for older veterans that might not be as familiar or have reliable internet services, that all factors in. One thing I'd like to note, I do recognize that some of the language on the slide doesn't reflect some shifts in best practices in terms of the language there with the MAT. This information was stated as it was reported in the referenced agencies. So kind of the difference between the MOUD or the MAT language there. Next slide, please. So some of our challenges and barriers right now. This slide specifically, these are by no means specific to just our SUD programming. As we move into looking more closely beyond just veterans and moving into the entirety of our SMVF population, these are kind of the issues that we as state agencies are recognizing as common areas, commonalities, areas for continued collaboration and continued focus. So we currently have no requirement for a common standardized identifier question regarding military connectedness across state agencies. While programs may ask, "Are you a veteran?" this question fails to properly identify individuals who may be eligible for and need services. Generally speaking, our community level providers are actually much better at asking more inclusive identifiers than our state agencies are. It's also noteworthy that asking even this question is not required for more than a few, the question of "Are you a veteran?" isn't required for more than a few programs that utilize federal funding within OHA. Jen, do you want to talk about this specific point a little bit more?
Yeah, and one of the things that we've seen, we all experience TRICARE and having the overall veteran, but what we experience in the Guard population is we rely on community care. We really do have to have the relationships with our community members. And so understanding that a misnomer a lot that we encounter in our state is that they just go to the VA or some other entity provides, or that the National Guard provides treatment or those services. And that is not the case for any National Guard. We absolutely have expertise inside the ranks, but they don't provide treatments across the communities of it. So we're really always trying to build those collaborative relationships with our community partners, but really understanding that most Guard personnel, unless they're coming back from an active duty situation where they will have eligibility for a shorter period of time, may not be eligible for VA healthcare or other veteran services. We will often see this around housing, resources, and things of that nature that is commonly associated or assumed that they're eligible and they are not. So.
Okay. So second point there, OHA's veteran program funds are really actually quite tightly regulated. And they're required basically for us, we have to provide direct service to veterans with little actual definition within the language of the legislation that provides like a definition to assist in any nuances there. So from a clinical standpoint, it's pretty obvious that direct clinical treatment and peer services would qualify. Upstream services such as outreach and education or the development of community support and resources should be considered direct service in this regard as well. However, like a refresh of that original 2019 study to assess the impact we've had so far and emerging needs would absolutely benefit in planning for future programming, not currently allowed. And it's restricting us to continue movement on the existing recommendations based on the fact that it's just older data and we don't have updated data. So funding can also be tied to restrictions, and this is kind of discussing it from a state standpoint and other agencies, restrictions on who different programs are allowed to serve. So even though generally our mission has shifted to that more broad SMVF community rather than just veterans, different agencies and providers operate based on different definitions of veteran and eligibility requirements tied to those definitions. So next point, while we are making progress, we do still run into problems due to lacking awareness of our actual SMVF landscape across agencies and providers. So while this can absolutely be due to like the frequent shifting in providers or people within specific positions, whole programs being created or eliminated, it's also just because of confusion in regard to the differences between elements of the SMVF community. So for example, Jen was actually gracious enough to come recently to present to several of my OHA colleagues regarding the Oregon National Guard and the many differences based on service eligibility, such as those TRICARE services. they were actually really shocked by the amount of info that they didn't know, and like how those differences could really impact the programming that they do. So finally, not unlike what many of us are dealing with across the nation, Oregon has issues with our number of providers, and especially culturally aware providers when we're talking about military connected individuals. So getting those that are serving the SMVF population paid in a timely manner through TRICARE, TriWest has come up recurrently from providers in community feedback. Also, the more we collaborate across agencies, the greater is that understanding that there are differences for additional requirements for serving existing service members, as Jen was discussing, rather than providers that only serve veterans through TRICARE, for example. This is absolutely an area of future educational potential. Jen, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to say here on the TRICARE too, right, of educating and understanding. TRICARE also has different varying levels. And because our state does not have an active duty installation, we often do not have providers who are authorized underneath an active component that your Guard personnel actually receive healthcare under, which is TRICARE Remote Prime, and versus a veteran VA status TRICARE. And those little systemic issues matter then when we're trying to get pathways and improve access coordination between communities and our service members and families. So, and then also to really think about those barriers here in the context, it's understanding the shifts of statuses that to the Guard, which we'll come a little bit later.
Okay, that's actually it for this slide. So it's next slide and back to you, Jen.
Yeah, thanks. So, when we're talking about the citizen soldiers, one of the things that we've really, I think our governor's challenge and others over the last several years, we've really, once we identified the gaps, right, of the maps, and we started talking together as community, because we have the same goal. We're all in the same mission, same fight, and really trying to understand it and improve it. And so what we've realized here is understanding our population, we see the variance of the gap from the communities of understanding and thinking that the VA is doing it. Also, our communities of care. We've had access to where our Guard personnel have tried to go into community providers and get and denied or turned away because they were informed to go get at the VA. And what we will say, anyone who's in the Guard and to trust, and we all understand this as vets and doing this work. And if we unfortunately don't do it right, it could have lasting impact. And we've seen that transpire. So it's also viewed differently by active duty components. A lot of your states around will be working with active duty installations for access as well. And they also have very similar challenges around access. So your Guard personnel kind of feel like, a stranger in both worlds. So really kind of understanding that in that. The other thing is the military culture for a Guard member is very unique. They have a civilian career, but will often have to be deployed or need that understanding from the community and employers of their disengagement with that, and it could impact their civilian careers. And so not adopting that also then causes heartache on our personnel because they're also in those communities and the impacts. And so that full culture of a traditional active duty that we are Alpha Company and I believe in aim high, or the ethos that is very prevalent in active duty because all of their resources are provided in that installation for the most part, does not happen at the Guard. So they will have it. They love the communities and the states that they actually serving in, and it can't be prouder of a mission. And we often in Oregon here, because we have a very big dichotomy of Portland, but we also have very rural belief that is not have the same culture and belief in regards to that county. So that variance also means we have to be adaptive in understanding those very unique microclimates of our population and where they're at. Also, most Guard personnel, we see trends that they do not want to bring and have traditional big family events like that are on the active duty, or because they're traveling so far from the installation to where they're at, it's not feasible to do that within the citizen soldier construct. So those stresses of deployments also are high, of integrating back. We just had a brigade come back, and a great example was I was meeting with one of the commanders. He was an 05 and had been deployed for over a year, came back, and in this entity was a high corporate executive inside one of our major employers in the state, and already had to take 14 days from his civilian employment to meet the obligations of the Guard after a deployment. So really balancing those two are a huge stressor within the force that we ask of our guardsmen. Next slide. So what does that look like? It kind of looks like this, right? There's opportunities that we've assessed unilaterally for our state. And I would encourage y'all to kind of think about these. This is kind of one of your homeworks that we've said. How can we help folks stay rooted in their community where they love and they serve from? Also serving the country and connecting to that community. The pride is just so amazing. We have it all the time. We live in the best city here, and I'm like, okay, well, I live down here and it's amazing, because we all have those great things about each of our states. What is the diversity of the experiences within the career folks that you're serving? If the person is beginning in their career versus a senior personnel in that career in the Guard, it really will matter about your approach and care to them. And then benefits. There's great opportunities for benefits. As Susan was describing in us, we are constantly trying to look at those pathways and opportunities. A lot of the challenges we've reviewed here too, balancing those demands of both careers, right? The expectation and desire more so than ever to maintain operational readiness is paramount for us as an organization, and also access to services. And so my push, and Susan can attest to this, it's always a thing. I am going to be representing the Guard, and I'm going to ask when the gap is there. And of course, it's uncomfortable in our conversations, but it's the only way we've been able to move forward. If we don't have that representation to say, hey, this is a gap. It's okay. It's a gap. Are we working on this gap? What are we doing? How are we doing one little chunk to do it? And then, of course, collectively understanding our TRICARE issues, not only for your community context, but also for the Guard, specifically for your Guard personnel, because that matters greatly for us as well. So those commonalities are the same challenges that I would say probably every community is dealing with, pretty universal. So, but it's a great thing for us. So Susan, next slide.
Okay, so versus that earlier slide that was looking at some barriers and opportunities to kind of overall programming in Oregon, this slide is very specific to the SUD programming for SMVF in Oregon. And there's obviously some overlap. So recognized areas of need and areas our programming is actively or beginning to address. We have dedicated veteran peer support specialists in several sites across Oregon that are very, they have lived experience, they are veterans, and we are very active in ensuring that they not only have the support within their treatment teams that is needed for them to do the actual work that they do, rather than maybe getting pulled in other directions or into other components that don't necessarily fit in their scope of work. But we're working on expanding those services so that they're more available across Oregon, especially in our rural communities. We're working to expand services, like I said, in the rural communities through telehealth opportunities, through just more support and connection Again, with those peer support specialists providing opportunities for them to resource with each other and connect, but also just more opportunities in general as funding allows. We continue to offer and advocate for military cultural awareness trainings. So just last year, for those of you that do remember going to that March 3rd presentation, I discussed a military cultural awareness for SUD providers training that we were able to bring with the help of the SMVF TA Center. They provided a trainer for us, came out, provided a really great kind of groundbreaking training for Oregon in terms of our ability to collaborate with the VA. They opened up a facility, availability of a facility for us to bring non-VA service providers onto the facility, kind of give them a little bit of a cultural shock behind the curtain, but discuss the actual kind of differences in military culture and how to provide those services to the SMVF community. So again, kind of focus especially on non-VA providers, but always to just the whoever needs the training in military cultural awareness. And we are continually working to strengthen relationships with VA colleagues to ensure a better continuum of care for the SMVF population. Kind of always going in, like I said, recognition of the fact that people move in and out of positions a lot. More recently, there were a lot of positions eliminated throughout the VA system. So the necessity of us actually having to go and get in front of people and meet people and be on a regular kind of, for lack of a better term, first name basis, so that we can allow for that continuum of care and resource sharing across our agencies. As discussed earlier, we're also advocating for that required standardized identifier question across state agencies so that we can just have more awareness of where the gaps in services are, more understanding of the needs across the entirety of the SMVF population, and just have more data to back up all of our choices with programming. Next slide. So yeah, this is our, oh, Phil, do you take this?
No, absolutely. Okay. I'll let you have it. Absolutely.
So our first facilitated discussion here. So how many of you within 30 seconds could access or currently have an understanding of your own state's heat map? And when we say heat map, kind of the entirety of the SMVF population as much as you have that data for, so including Guard and Reserve. What is the landscape of the military connected community in your state? So again, active duty bases versus Guard and Reserve facilities, rural versus urban, kind of all those different maps that we presented already. Yeah, opening it up to anybody with comments or questions. Jen, pipe in, please.
Yeah, I'm gonna give him a chance to think because we really want to hear. Do y'all in your space here talk about the gaps of maybe where your population or where you want to be curious to define it and learn about it more?
Feel free to either use that raise hand or enter your question in the chat.
Okay. And if you don't, right, we would encourage really thinking about that because it does matter. It matters for equity and care of your communities with it. So I see Oklahoma and Cliff. Go ahead, Cliff.
Hey, Cliff.
Hey, how's it going? I actually think I can define it pretty well, but it's taken my entire career to say that though. So despite me saying like, yeah, I think I could do it, it's taken my entire career to feel confident saying that.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a nuanced when we're talking service member veterans and families, right? And it's not a straightforward answer. If we think of it only as in the VA lens for so long positioned, yes, that's a dominant, but the dynamics that is happening now in these generations really is mixed. National Guard serves more and does more deployments than your active duty population around your states. So really understanding that usage within your state is really important. Deb, I see you got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm in New Hampshire. I work for the Bureau of Drug and Alcohol Services here as a community development specialist. So I've been spending time out at the base trying to meet folks and understand what some of the resources are there. The same gaps that you outlined here are exactly what I see in New Hampshire, exactly. And I've been trying to work with the veterans groups. Well, actually, the state office of military veterans of I can never get the right DMVAS. I work with them. I'm part of their steering committee for veterans homelessness, and we're going to be doing a summit next week with all the providers, trying to bring together the community providers and the veterans providers to talk about where the gaps in services are, to make sure. What I've learned is that folks who are active military or vets don't know about the community services that we have on the outside, the free services in our recovery centers and all of that. So I've been trying to link between the two systems to try to educate and provide resources and facilitate collaboration. And so the same group that I'll be meeting with next week is going to be doing that with a number of providers, both through the veterans and through the community. So there's some efforts underway here to try to link services and make sure folks can access what they need for alcohol and drug support.
Yeah, that's great. It's great to hear. And, it starts just with the conversation, right? And building the coalitions across. Every state, and in your air wings, if you have an air installation, you have some fantastic personnel there. You have directors of psychological health who absolutely would be a great connection point. They're an amazing group of folks taking care of veterans, as well as family readiness specialists. And every state has them. And if not, by all means, the integrated primary prevention workforce personnel can also help connect, because that's what we're all trying to do. We're all in that same service, and really kind of help nuance and understand that localized nuance of every state, because every state does operate differently based off of your own state laws and those types of things. But broad speaking, we definitely have seen these gaps pretty resoundingly consistent across states based off of legal or technical definitions or programs that started maybe as, victorious cycles and virtuous, but now is a gap because of the evolution and the change of your military population and the operations that have happened since OIF and OEF. And so that adaptation that we've seen in the actual population and doing this work, then we're kind of lagging, I think, in some of this stuff. So yeah. Anyone else? We really appreciate the discussion. I'm just going to say it's hard to just be at the sides. I mean, I talk to myself all the time, so maybe it's not so bad, but yeah. Okay.
And kind of speak to what Deb said, I'll say, as from a veteran standpoint, I think it's definitely worth really highlighting, and the fact that, veterans and service members often don't know what is existing in the community that's not VA based. That's not, even I talk to a lot of veterans that don't know the difference between the state level VA and the federal level VA, and that those are two different entities, and that they, provide different services. So, from a veteran standpoint and having conversations with VA colleagues, I think there is an awareness amongst us that do this work that the VA is very kind of come to us centered. Like, the expectation is for, if you need services, you go there. And they're getting better about outreach for sure. They've got, community engagement and partnership coordinators now, the CEPCs, that do really amazing work out in the communities and develop their coalitions. And they are some of our, greatest allies in terms of really collaborating with the VA and getting this resource sharing stuff that I keep talking about. They are really great advocates for that. But yeah, I think it's on us as state agencies and in collaboration with community providers to really keep doing the outreach and the education to the communities so that they know what's available. Yeah. Any other thoughts or anything in the chat? I haven't checked it.
Yeah, hearing none, let's move on to the next slide. All right. So why does it matter, right? Like, why does it matter being able to have that visual thing? What we know for the National Guard is when we partner with our communities where our service members live, the adverse and illnesses of despairs within the community are actually less. The better that is, the better our actual outcomes are. And even downstream, when and if they meet that veteran eligibility, because they're used to access, prevention is definitely, an ounce of prevention's higher than the cure, right? Is that the statement? So it's something to kind of think about there. We can stop the progression, advancement of certain things. And a good example, too, of understanding why that's important is for us, and we'll use the most recent Department of War information that was released in 2024 here, the DOD or DOW released their annual suicide report. Right. And when we're thinking about substance misuse and that, I'm just going to give some highlights here about focusing on those social determinants of health and understanding where that access is. The few of those major findings out of that report, it just got published in March of this year, which it captured for 2024. There was 407 service members that died by suicide in CY24. It was down from 531 in CY23. Active duty suicide rates dropped about 16% year over year. So for those 2 years, active duties had a reduction. The reserve rates also decreased. The National Guard rates increased compared to the prior year. Firearms were the primary method of suicide across all components. It didn't matter. And it also highlighted really what for close to 30 years, the Department of Defense /War has been highlighting. What we are seeing is the highest risk group remains junior enlisted under 30. Now, keep in mind, let's go back to the maps for Oregon in the veteran services and population. It's all older and it's targeted there. Well, ours here, which are not included in that, are younger, under 30, younger males. Also, divorce and separation status was associated with higher rates. Again, relationships, long-term relationships in relationships, maybe, right? We can, public health, we can assume if they're older veterans and if they're married, they've had that relationship. They've learned how to have that relationship that works for that couple. Officers and older female service members generally showed lower rates comparatively, right, in that report. But it also showed in that report risk factors, again, that says, hey, in regards to Army and Marines, we're higher. All of your states have an Army population National Guard. That is included in that. So understanding that. Also, the wording in the report, and I'm going to use quotes here because I think it's interesting for us to understand in community context. They talked around, and they say this in the report, combat operations, tactical occupations, or close combat roles. So the language, depending on the set, is what's being referenced. So it's something to note that combat arms related or direct combat oriented specialties, our state is an infantry main mission state, and those will be considered in that. So understanding that mission set is important in context of that. The DoD, of course, has not, or broader military suicide research, of course, has said deployment alone is not a strong predictor. Instead, what it is, the risk is combinations of alcohol use, substance, care, representation. It potentially leaves us there. Sleep disruption, relationship strain, masculine or help-seeking culture barriers, which is what I referenced in our live example that we had. The one that was brave enough and courageous enough to go and then was turned away because and never and identity tied to mission or performance, and then transition out of the Guard or service as a whole, and disciplinary stressors were the lead risk. It also is something to understand that more heavily than prior suicide reports, they're really talking about that public health, social connectedness, lethal means safety, relationship and community factors. They're really asking in really understanding how that works, and then our internal organizational climate. So specifically for the National Guard, the stressors also are indicated. Civilian employment instability causes severe financial strain at times. Also fragmented support systems, geographic isolation from care and others, even within their unit because they may travel, reduced daily unit cohesion because of the National Guard's uniqueness, and then barriers to accessing services. So it's really showing each of our states, hey, this is a pathway. How do we do it? And so our approach here, as my three little boxes and Susan's, we strongly believe in partnering with communities where our service members live, really trying to focus on our overall social determinants of health and illnesses of despairs in our communities, and supporting each other and working with them, and understanding microclimates of the variety and vast differences all over your state, which it's its own challenge for sure. So I'm going to go to the next slide. All right. So when we take the bigger constructs, right, we talked about, hey, how does that look for us in the military? All of those risk and protective factors that could lead to a substance misuse or substance use disorder will actually show up in all of these. So I just will encourage everyone to understand that, yes, we're talking about substance use, and we're highlighting this. Susan and ourselves and our governor's chaplains are also looking at all of these, because it could be so determinant on one person about what the adverse event, if the risks are there. So we're really trying to align services together, work on coordination and collaboration across those, and to include our service members and families in that representation and meet those needs. And it's not easy, as the heat map, right? When you have about 4,000 service members with no VA, community services that they can access, it's a great challenge, one that we're trying to take head on. So I'll turn it to Susan. Next slide.
Okay, so if we think back to those SED trends that we went over for Oregon veterans a little bit earlier, and again, keep in mind that those are SED trends for Oregon veterans, but we're not tracking as specifically, unfortunately, the entirety of our SMVF population to include our Guards members. And the continued knowledge and work that Jen and I and other state agency reps are doing to make sure that we are being inclusive for the entirety of our SMVF population. Thinking back to that, and the continued barriers and opportunities for Oregon's SUD system, you can see that we are doing several things that are addressing some of those identified areas. So examples here, in regard to alcohol and opioid use, we have a lot of collaboration and consultation, you can say internally to the OHA programming with our Rethink the Drink campaign, our 988 campaigns to really ensure that we are trying to be as inclusive as possible and really providing outreach that makes veterans and service members feel seen, that makes them, see themselves as, part of being able to access these resources. Cultural awareness and peer services. So like I mentioned earlier, we're putting peers into the communities and increasing peer services, those certified peer services within treatment courts, that are veteran treatment courts, by requiring certification for the peers so that they can not only provide mentorship, but they can provide real training and support opportunities for not only the veterans that volunteer within veteran treatment court, but also the individuals who are justice involved. We're increasing the number of providers, again, who are culturally aware through collaboration with SUD provider organizations, collaboration across our agencies and our community providers. So we're working to ensure that there is a veteran presence, a veteran voice on a lot of our clinical boards. Again, referencing back to that March 3rd presentation and that military cultural awareness for SUD provider training, that was a collaboration between OHA, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, and providing a facility, and then our Oregon chapter of NADAC, so is the Oregon Association for Addiction Professionals. And then we're also working to provide kind of state agency and provider representation on the more national level boards. So NADAC's Military and Veteran Affairs Committee, for example, and giving feedback regarding, inclusion of LPCs within their regulations, or, a better presence for peer support specialists and whatnot. We also are working to have a greater veteran voice in our Oregon campus SUD initiative areas, making sure that the veterans are being represented when it comes to SUD initiatives in campuses, with the knowledge that, our veteran population and our service member population in college areas and university areas is going to probably look a little different than the traditional student that goes straight out of high school, for example. So we have a strong collaboration with ODVA and community level providers to provide outreach. So ODVA, our state level Department of Veteran Affairs, and community providers in providing outreach and education across our state and in many locations across Pride season. So we do a lot of outreach and education and resourcing and service sharing for service members and veterans and their families at different Pride events. And it's really amazing to get that feedback from the community, especially in a location where it's not really expected a lot of times. So within OHA veteran programming, initiative areas are always focused on, again, those 19 recommendations that came out of that 2019 study. We're also very focused, as Jen was saying, on that upstream programming with the belief that it all ties to reducing suicide within the SMVF population, to include, obviously, all of our SUD programming, which we're more focused on today. Next slide, please. So areas for our continued collaboration and continued need. So we've been really fortunate with the Oregon Governor's Challenge. Our team, it's where we've really grown in terms of building stronger collaborative efforts, stronger relationships, and really creating an environment where we are sharing resources, sharing event information and opportunities and needs. Honestly, like sharing when we are recognizing needs and community feedback that we didn't really have that kind of that relationships earlier and before our Governor's Challenge work. Movement on our initial initiative area, which was post-vention programming, has allowed us to increase state agency presence with local community programs and initiatives. It's increased our collaboration with the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, again, with those community engagement and partnership coordinators, and them bringing our post-vention programming into the communities. We've been able to increase kind of community feedback, allowing for a greater understanding and access to available resources. Now we're moving into our next initiative area focused on lethal mean safety, which obviously includes medication safety. So again, with that SUD programming, we're trying to extend our reach. As we brought up, I said we were going to keep bringing it up. So we have this Ask the Question kind of initiative area that we are very highly collaborating on together. So when we say that, we're meaning more than just that ask, are you a veteran, but being more inclusive and asking the question, have you ever served in the U.S. Armed Forces, to include National Guard and Reserve. So in our positions, Jen and I have talked a lot about how within our agencies, we recognize the unique position that we have where we can both receive feedback from the community and be responsive to the community to a degree, and community level providers, as well as we get to advocate for the SMVF community and try to influence decisions at higher levels than us. While, I think a lot of times I know I will go into the community, and as soon as I say I'm from, Oregon's Health Authority, there's this assumption that I have power that I don't have for sure. But recognition of being kind of in that middle spot where we do have some level of ability to really be out in the community, get good feedback, but get buy-in, and then take that back to our higher ups and really advocate for what we're seeing is the need in the community. So the Ask the Question initiative, we are highly trying to get all of our state agencies on board with really advocating for this. This this collaboration is what has allowed us, and our kind of ability to be right in the middle there has allowed us to continue making progress in the face of restrictions that I've mentioned a few times here. And even when progress feels slow, I think we are really good at recognizing and reminding each other that we are indeed making progress. Noteworthy that through and due to especially my collaboration with Jen, we're attempting to increase our programming focused on transition areas. So one of those recommendations from that 2019 study was the knowledge that transition areas for service members can be particularly difficult and can have a higher potential for suicidal ideation and suicide rates. So focusing on those transition areas with very specific awareness of that repeated transition from service to civilian life for our Guard members. So continued networking, resource sharing, actually being in the community, as I've mentioned, and ensuring buy-in with the community and with other community level providers, all areas of ongoing need, all areas that I would encourage everyone to work on and continue collaborating within your own service network. I believe personally these are the most fun areas for me. I really enjoy going out into the community. Like I said, across our summer we get to attend these Pride events and do a lot of outreach and engagement. And that's really the part that kind of bolsters my love for the work that I do. Yeah, so I think that's about it. I think we can move into the next Q&A. Okay, if anybody has ideas, has thoughts, wants to talk about their own effective initiatives and programming and strategies for collaboration and communication with your partners, we'd love to hear about it.
Folks do have a question or want to share a little bit about any successes or strategies that you've worked on in your own community, you can use that raise hand or enter through the chat.
I was in clinical practice for like 7 years, so I can just sit in silence for a long time.
Cliff, yeah, go ahead, Cliff.
I'll break the awkward silence and go again. Before this role, I worked at a local state agency, and I worked on the intervention side. Of my job was to be a TA provider for all the all the behavioral health centers in the state. And I had some assigned, so I got to know them really, really well. And that's where my previous comment where I mentioned were because that way I got really well connected. I knew all the providers, and I had those relationships. But I've been removed for several years, so I'm starting to, because of turnover, I don't have those same relationships that I once did with some areas. But I'm IPPW in the National Guard of my state, but there's a DPH who was a provider who then moved over to the DPH role, and we're at two different sides of the state. And because we knew each other in our previous roles and then moved over to this independently, that internal relationship plus our external relationships that we haven't been able to always solve every problem, but because of our previously established relationships, we've been able to get real answers and get real roads and bridges made to help our service members. And again, it may not be the exact answer that fixes the problem, but we're able to give some real answers and provide real direction. And if it wasn't for those relationships, um, it would not have been helpful at all.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
relationships are king, right? Like I think Susan and I would tell you, it's the relationships. And also I think the vulnerability of wicked complex problems, right? Like they're not easily solved or identified or even defined until you're in it. So lots of great people doing lots of great things, but it is really understanding and communicating and having good relationships. So I fully agree. That's awesome, Cliff. Let me tell you, it's awesome.
Well, thank you. And if I could add just a little bit to it, I would say if we didn't trust each other and like each other, I think the work wouldn't be as fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that ties back to what I was meaning by when I said buy-in. So getting buy-in from the community, but also like from your fellow, agency representatives and all of that. I mean, very similar, I think. The person that was in my position prior, so I said this position has been around since 2017. I've only been in it for a couple of years, and my predecessor moved to another state agency, still providing services to veterans, but that historical knowledge hasn't left, which is amazing. Like we have a good relationship. So if something pops up that I'm like, that was before my time, I reach out. She's always super, willing to help, but also if something pops up on her side and she's like, hey, because she doesn't have the funding availability, so she might reach out to me and say, hey, do we have room for the. So having those super collaborative and again, yeah, trusting relationships is really important. And I think especially I think we all probably recognize the value of having people that know the population, especially those of us that have served, being able to help develop and provide services and kind of working together is, I've always found that to be just very, very beneficial. So we all speak the same language to a degree. So.
I really appreciate y'all participating and hanging in here today. We really enjoyed it. Thank you for that.
Unless there's other comments, we can move to the next slide. Okay. So wrapping up, I think our next steps and homework thing is kind of, and Jen, absolutely chime in, but challenging you to just know your landscape, know your SMVF landscape beyond just who, veterans by standard definition and eligibility requirements. Again, know your definitions. So know who is operating under which definitions. And, if you have programming in your state that can be more broad in their service provision because they don't maybe operate under the same definitions, that's great information to know for the serving the entirety of the population. And then influence other programs within your agency and community to do the same. So to know the landscape, to know what definitions they're operating under. Like I said, for me within OHA, a very small workforce dedicated to a large population, and there's a lot of programs within OHA that don't necessarily consider the veteran or the SMVF population. And they don't really know the difference between asking, are you a veteran, or have you ever served in the U.S. Armed Forces? So continuing and advocating and continuing to have those conversations and to keep pushing for it sometimes feels like beating your head against a wall, but I think that's part of the necessary requirements for doing this work. Jen, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just encourage, we start often and talk about that if you cannot define it of your population, like your definition, you definitely can't measure what you can offer or not. And if you can't measure it, you can't understand it. And if you can't understand it, you can't change it. And it takes everybody. It takes everyone in the coalition and their perspective and nuances And if they're not on your areas, we would encourage to share the wealth and the load. There's plenty to be done and share across. So that coalition building is just such a strong component of this work. And then that.
Unless there's questions, next slide, and it's just our contact info. And thank you everyone for hanging in.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jennifer, so much for that amazing presentation, the prep work that went into it. And thank you to the audience for the discussion. I think covering the landscape, some of those fence barriers, setting that National Guard context, and I think being able to move from identifying the problem to then, some of that response building and partnerships and initiatives that you've all created was a really substantive session for all of us. So I know the recording will definitely go out to everyone along with the slides and as well as the chat. So I want to thank you both again for bringing the data, which I always very much enjoy, along with the lived experience and what you all are doing in the community. So thank you all. I'll move now into just briefly the wrap up. I think there's just a few additional slides here. This is the optional homework we were alluding to, optional, of course, but taking kind of what the discussion was today and bringing it back to your own community. Maybe take some time with your team to think about that, that 30-second question, right? That first facilitated question of, do you know where these various programs and pieces are? So mapping, whether that's active duty, Guard Reserve, some of the rural versus urban access points, community providers. So there's the optional homework. Next slide. And here's just a plug for our RAND webinar series on advancing data policy and prevention for our SMVF. There's a QR code there that'll get you right to the registration there for our 6-part series that is still ongoing. A great series and sessions there. So if you are able to register or have some colleagues who would be interested, you can pass that along or register through that. And again, this will be in the slides that are provided to you all. Next slide. And to stay up to date with all of our kind of ongoing virtual convenings, our upcoming events and everything in between, you can do so by registering to our topics in the news. You can do so through that QR code. You can also access it through the SAMHSA SMVF TA Center subpage on the SAMHSA main page there, just to stay in the loop with all of our upcoming events. Next slide. And an opportunity for you to share your feedback on this learning community here. There's a QR code there to an evaluation. We very much take into account the feedback you all provide, especially, how it went, how it, kind of responds to the work that you're doing in your own community and the research there. And also, if you have any, potential topic ideas for the future, we always will take all of that into account. So thank you. That should only take a minute or two to complete that survey. I'll leave that up on the screen for another 30 seconds or so as folks are able to take a picture of that to get into the evaluation there. All right. Next slide, please. All right, and that's it. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Heading into the Memorial Day weekend, have a nice, long, restful Memorial Day weekend, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you all. Enjoy the afternoon.